Hi, folks. I'm Shadrach Straley, a senior studying history and journalism, and it's my pleasure to introduce Noah Rothman. Mr. Rothman is an associate editor at Commentary Magazine and a regular contributor at MSNBC and NBC, making regular appearances on shows like Morning Joe. I had the pleasure of speaking with Mr. Rothman several times over the course of the day, too many times if you ask Mr. Rothman. And I was struck by the nuance and biting accuracy that he brought to his analysis of both current affairs and the entertainment/news industry. Mr. Rothman is also the author of the subject of his speech tonight, the book Unjust, Social Justice and the Unmaking of America. Mr. Rothman received praise for the book from several influential voices, including Ben Shapiro and Jonah Goldberg, but in my mind, the best review comes from the head of our very own Radio Free Hillsdale, Mr. Scott Bertram, who wrote on his Twitter feed that this is great writing, filled with ideas and arguments, and not merely a laundry list of ridiculous SJW activity. Highly recommended. A soaring endorsement if I've ever heard one. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Noah Rothman.
Thank you all for coming out. I appreciate it, and I apologize to Shadrach, who has heard all of this before multiple times today. On a basic level, social justice is an idea that is inherently American. In the abstract, it is an ideological commitment to equality and fairness, seeking restitution for historical wrongs and achieving reconciliation. In practice, it has become something far more sinister. Modern social justice is identity politics in application. It is an alternative form of social organization that is in many ways antithetical to the American ideal. Its activists have endorsed pernicious and psychologically damaging ideas, among them that the notions that meritocracy, for example, in America is a myth, that individual agency is a lie, that your course in life is in many ways predestined by your accidents of birth, that separatism is good, explicitly, because it prevents social discomfort, and that colorblindness in institutions is naive at best and dangerous at worst. Social justice advocates on the left may be surprised to learn that white nationalists believe all of this too. The overlapping ideological similarities between social justice advocates on the left and the right are so pronounced that they have become reflections of one another. Modern social justice ideology instructs its adherents to see society as an unnavigable matrix of overlapping persecutions, sapping them of agency and robbing them of individuality. And when the political system fails to meet their unrealistic expectations, it leads its devotees to lash out, occasionally with violence. Social justice has noble origins and a robust philosophical foundation of which its most committed advocates may not even be aware. Social justice originates out of the Catholic Church in the mid-19th century as a response to a largely secular Protestant Enlightenment. While it had some collectivist elements in the inception, it was less of a governing theory and more of a way to think about charity. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, the philosopher John Rawls put some more meat on these bones. To establish social justice as a means to achieve historical fairness and rectitude, he devised a new way for us to think about social justice. Rawlsian thought advocates thinking about justice as though it were a finite commodity that needed to be distributed in an enlightened fashion. But to do that, the enlightened distributor must operate behind a theoretical construct he called the veil of ignorance, so that the enlightened distributor would not be able to satisfy his or her biases, conscious or otherwise. Modern social justice advocates have no use for the veil of ignorance. How can there be an enlightened distribution if the distributor does not know who the oppressed are and who are their oppressors? Who has benefited from historical conditions and who suffers from them? Who must be lifted up and who is due a comeuppance? This is the essential flaw in Rawlsian thought, as diagnosed in a comprehensive assault on the idea of social justice by Friedrich Hayek. Hayek posited that the minute an institution engages in the unequal distribution of justice, it becomes an unjust institution on Rawls's own terms. The more an institution commits to addressing inequalities through discriminatory mechanisms, the more inequality it causes. To give in to these temptations of distributive justice is to empower the state and invite collectivism. And that, in Hayek's estimation, was the pathway to tyranny. None of this is to suggest that social justice advocates fixate on life's biggest questions, quite the contrary. Increasingly, the adherents of this new ideology are consumed by small things. They direct their ire more frequently at their fellow social justice advocates, comic book creators, restaurateurs, artists, film and television producers, young adult novelists, and so on. By targeting their outrage at people who are most predisposed to supplicate before their demands, the social justice advocates project power and efficacy, even if it's only an illusion. The content that social justice advocates on the right and the left are so frequently consumed by are not politics. They have nothing to do with legislative affairs. They are more aptly described as culture wars. Participation in these fights mimics the passions of politics, without forcing its participants to do any of the requisite homework necessary to understand how Washington truly works. In effect, this condition has rendered social justice advocates gullible targets of willing manipulators, and nothing so exemplifies this new phenomenon as the phenomenon of woke brands. The razor brand Gillette recently generated some rare attention for itself when it launched an advertisement attacking the supposed scourge of toxic masculinity. "We expect debate," said Gillette's North American brand director. "Actually, a discussion is quite necessary." Indeed, earned media was the entire point of this nearly 2-minute-long web advertisement. Nike launched a national campaign featuring former 49ers quarterback Colin Kaepernick, who ignited a controversy by becoming one of the first NFL players to take a knee during the national anthem. "Believe in something, even if it means sacrificing everything," the ad read. Far from sacrificing anything, Nike's sales jumped by 10%. The car brand Audi dedicated millions to a Super Bowl advertisement perpetuating the flawed notion that women as a gender make only a fraction of what a man makes for the same occupation. They, too, sold more product. None of these firms suffered as a result of their political activism, just the opposite. Not only do consumers no longer recoil at the mixing of social politics and commerce, they actively seek out socially conscious brands. A savvy firm knows precisely how to manipulate these well-meaning sentiments, and nothing better illustrates that than the tale of Fearless Girl. On March 8, 2017, New Yorkers awoke to the sight of a new monument in Manhattan, a bronze statue of an elementary school-age girl standing defiant, arms akimbo, directly across from Wall Street's iconic charging bull. The statue was instantly feted by the usual suspects on the Democratic left as the feminine antidote to that snarling symbol of capitalist energy. New York City's Mayor Bill de Blasio insisted that the statue's value was rooted in the fact that it made men uncomfortable. Senator Elizabeth Warren made a pilgrimage down to Lower Manhattan to be photographed alongside the statue with the caption, "Fight like a girl." New York Times columnist Gail Collins insisted that the statue represented the most powerful expression of female political energy since the mid-19th century movement to eliminate gender segregation on New York City's trolleys. The statue's sponsor, the investment firm State Street Global Advisors, said its effort was designed to communicate to the financial services industry that women are woefully underrepresented in its upper echelons. State Street would know. At the time, women occupied only 17% of its leadership positions. No woman had ever occupied the role held by Fearless Girl's chief spokesman, President Ronald O'Hanley, and the diversionary purpose of this public relations campaign was soon revealed by the courts. In October of 2017, State Street agreed to settle a lawsuit after a Department of Labor audit found that they had been systematically discriminating against their female and black employees. They had to shell out about $5 million. Consumers think they are advancing social justice by patronizing woke brands, but they are almost always being taken in by firms who merely want to cater to their customers' well-meaning desire to appear informed without doing the research. Entry-level politics has become a lucrative enterprise for the unscrupulous, and it is deeply troubling that the product the public is unwittingly consuming is civic illiteracy. For a growing cohort on the social justice left, the measured approach to civil rights displayed by historical advocates, such as the American Civil Liberties Union, is an obstacle on the path to karmic equality. After all, quote, "colorblind logic," wrote Kay Sue Park, a critical race studies fellow at UCLA, has, quote, "never secured real freedom or even safety for all." The right's so-called race realists share Ms. Park's view that institutional colorblindness is unscientific and morally obtuse. The tenets of this new faith proscribe what the University of California system called the myth of meritocracy. Among the forbidden microaggressions are boilerplate expressions of patriotism like "America is the land of opportunity," and "everyone can succeed in this society if they work hard enough." Pupils are instructed that they cannot achieve their dreams without the aid of enlightened liberal Sherpas. Racial segregation in American schools and universities is making a comeback. Faculty and administrators defend the concept of demographically distinct safe spaces and racially segregated cafeteria tables in order to prevent what they call, quote, uncomfortable learning. No longer are students augmenting their preferred fields of study with complementary lifestyles. The idea that study has anything to do with this is a pretense that has finally been abandoned. While a legitimate theory for understanding prejudice, the theory of intersectionality has transformed its adherents into paranoiacs. As a way to understand prejudice, how it manifests in the real world, intersectionality is valid and valuable. It prescribes understanding prejudice as being doled out in degrees, and that some individuals may experience more discrimination based on their discrete traits than others. In practice, however, as a political organizing principle, intersectionality has disempowered its advocates. Intersectionality compels its adherents to perceive themselves as combatants in a war of all against all. Its effects are particularly evident in how it led the Women's March to tear itself apart. Women's March organizers were embroiled in a scandal last year when it was revealed that its members could not view their allies as partners so long as they had traits intersectionality deems inherently privileging. They sacrificed relationships with fellow organizers who were Jewish because, in the words of Tamika Mallory, they, quote, uphold white supremacy, whether they know it or not. Intersectionality has also compelled the Women's March organizers to embrace noxious elements like the convicted cop killer Assata Shakur or the overtly anti-Semitic minister Louis Farrakhan, people with no political constituency, but who claim to be fighting against the same forces of oppression the Women's March opposed. To abandon them would be to legitimize the prejudices against which they claim to struggle. We are regressing to a point where we have ascribed status based on hereditary traits. That is the only way to describe the so-called, quote, right to be believed, an idea endorsed by figures as prominent as Hillary Clinton, which requires deference, not impartiality, to the claims of alleged sexual assault survivors. Adherents believe that misogyny is so interwoven into American institutions that such allegations are not fairly adjudicated in the justice system as it is currently constituted. In practice, this led to a conceptual redefinition of justice that resulted in the Dear Colleague letter of 2011 and the undesirable status quo that followed. The letter prescribed for students in colleges and universities new guidelines for adjudicating claims of sexual assault on campus. On a philosophical level, the idea was buttressed by the social justice theory. It held that the United States is ill-equipped to prosecute such claims fairly. Sexual violence is defined too narrowly. Evidentiary standards for convictions in a courtroom are too high. The requirement that an abuser must be forced to confront her alleged abuser is simply too traumatic. The result of this redefinition of justice was, however, to create a series of new victims. When the, quote, verdicts reached in these campus tribunals were revisited in real courtrooms, it was often found that accuser and accused alike had their First, Fifth, and Sixth Amendment rights abridged. Millions of dollars were paid out by colleges to students who were mistreated in these tribunals. Social justice advocates have confused racial enlightenment with stereotyping, as exemplified by the recent confrontation between MAGA hat-clad teenagers and Catholics from a Catholic school and a black nationalist group fronted by a Native American man. The Atlantic's James Fallows explicitly rejected the idea of individuality in this conflict. To him, he advised that we look at these teenagers as the nondescript heirs to the 20th century's segregationists, and their abusers were the righteous, aggrieved victims. The Washington Post saw this as a chance to litigate the historic injustices the Catholic Church had visited upon America's indigenous populations. In both cases, these people were not people, they were members of a tribe. So too, for Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, who was judged by American elites based solely on his demographic traits. The paucity of hard evidence before the public relating to the allegations against him was such that observers drew from their own personal experience in the effort to judge his case. What emerged from that introspection is what we would call in any other context prejudice. Kavanaugh's indignance over being tried in a mock tribunal on criminal claims was evidence of his, quote, an entitled white man acting like the new minority, wrote New York Times opinion writer Maureen Dowd. ABC News analyst Matthew Dowd suggested that Kavanaugh's episode was an indication that, quote, we as white male Christians should, quote, give up our seats at the table. The essayist Rebecca Solnit raised the stakes of Kavanaugh's confirmation to nearly existential heights. This is a battle over whether we will be a country for all of us, a democracy in which everyone matters and all are equal, or a citadel of white male privilege, she wrote. It wasn't the allegation at all, but the reversal of power dynamics for white men that led Kavanaugh to lash out, wrote Jennifer Palmieri, the former communications director for Hillary Clinton's 2016 campaign. As we go through the reckoning of this lopsided power balance, she wrote, there's going to be a lot more of this. In the end, only Georgetown University Associate Professor Christine Fair pushed the bounds of propriety too far by advocating, quote, miserable deaths and posthumous castration for, quote, entitled white men who reserved judgment on Kavanaugh. These sentiments resulted in her temporary suspension from the classroom. The right has long known that this kind of divisive identity politics is ugly, anti-intellectual, and deleterious to national comity. And then, in 2016, they forgot. In many ways, Donald Trump beat the social justice left at their own game. He inculcated in his supporters a sense of grievance that was philosophically alien to conservatism, convincing his most enthusiastic voters that forces greater than them were responsible for their lots in life. Their identity, be it white, Christian, conservative, working class, or what have you, was not only looked down upon by elites in positions of power, but discriminated against. By appealing to identitarianism to win the Republican nomination, Trump drove an 18-wheeler through the standards that had governed political discourse on the right, and out of this breach cascaded a familiar horde that went by a new name, the alt-right. White nationalism is perhaps the primordial form of identity politics in America, and its program is social justice for white people. Its members revel in self-pity. They are hypersensitive to perceived slights against their race and culture. They are convinced that society has erected insurmountable obstacles in their path to success. They seek only fairness, they contend, as do their progressive counterparts. There's a case to be made that Trump's attacks on liberal speech and thought policing was a necessary antidote to the left's successes. That may be the kind of resentment politics that satisfies conservatives, but it is resentment nonetheless. It also concedes that Trump contributed to precisely the same balkanization of the American electorate that the right resents when the left is doing the balkanizing. Conservatives cannot reject an identity politics practiced by their adversaries while simultaneously adopting a style of it for themselves. Only the most cynical would knowingly embrace such hypocrisy. My book is not an attack on identity politics per se. To do so would argue against human nature. Nor is it an assault on self-actualization or racial and cultural awareness. That would be to argue from a position of ignorance. Unjust is an attack on a pernicious new form in which identity politics suffices as a governing ethos. Once an idea that helped us think about fairness and rectitude, social justice has become the antithesis of blind, objective justice. American institutions are simply not capable of delivering the downward social leveling that social justice advocates increasingly believe is necessary. So what happens to you when you've adopted a burning moral imperative to which institutions are absolutely unresponsive? Two things. One, you become disillusioned and you disengage from the political process. The other is that you resolve to radicalize and attack the foundations of these institutions because they are so profoundly immoral that they cannot be allowed to stand. That's why, in my view, we have seen an explosion of political violence over the last decade. More and more Americans are witnessing violence in the streets between these two ideological extremes, more violence than we have seen in a generation. This is, I believe, part of a trend, and it is one that must be stopped. As social justice advocates increasingly reveal, theirs is a malleable philosophy based on articles of faith that encourage racial hierarchies and social stratification. For its advocates, achieving social equality requires social leveling, and to secure that equality, public and private institutions must treat individuals unequally, and there is no justice in that. Thank you.
We'll now open for a period of questioning. Does anybody have a question?
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
So my question is regarding the viral Morning Joe clip on your book. The lady on the panel basically said, you are a straight white male. You can't actually understand these things because you haven't actually experienced them. So I guess, is there any hope in talking with people that dismiss your argument based on your own experience? How can they possibly be?
Absolutely, there are. That's Tiffany Cross, and the two of us have had lunches together since. We've started something of a friendship. She had not had the opportunity to read the book because it had come out 48 hours prior, so it wasn't really easy for them to address the issues in the book. But absolutely, so that argument is probably the predominant pushback on this book, is you simply do not possess the experience required to opine on these issues with any authority, because you do not have the demographic traits. And that, to me, is a form of ad hominem, which is inherently fallacious. There's really no buttressing that argument, because there's no argument there to buttress. So if you just simply don't accept the premise, eventually they give it up. It doesn't really take long to say, okay, well, these are ideas, and you can engage with these ideas, or you can continue to say that I don't have the authority to engage in those, to talk about these ideas. And it doesn't take long before you break down those barriers. But that is initially the first pushback that you get.
I was wondering if you've done any research into implicit bias testing and that sort of stuff.
Algorithms?
Yes.
Yeah.
And if you could comment on that, how that works.
Yeah, so algorithms are data sets, and they're as good as the inputs. So if you input garbage, you're going to get garbage. And human beings are fallible and prone to bias and racism and discrimination. And this book makes no effort to say that that's not real. It is. What the problem is that what the argument that is being made by social justice advocates is that we can address discrimination with more discrimination. And by making arguments that are inherently flawed if you're trying to attract a coalition. And the example that I would use for that is the most recent passage by a Republican Congress signed by a Republican president of criminal justice reform. The First Step Act acknowledges, albeit tacitly and not to the satisfaction of its advocates, inherent racial disparities in the criminal justice system. That's a good thing, but you got there as a result of consensus building that allowed people to approach their own coalitions and constituencies with arguments for self-interest and arguments that the civil rights era's leaders used, which is you are not living up to your ideals, the American ideal. And you wouldn't have gotten there if you'd have said, sit down, shut up, and check your privilege. That's not an argument. But that's increasingly what we see on the social justice left primarily, but it's not exclusive. So the argument being prejudices exist, therefore we have to meet that with some new discriminatory mechanisms in order to achieve equality is not a new idea. It's inherently flawed. And this book is an effort to reignite a lot of those old arguments that we seem to have forgotten.
I guess I kind of have like a very similar question. So as far as like when implicit bias goes, like the whole argument, I guess, with implicit bias is that there are certain groups that are inherently harmed, I guess, specifically by implicit bias. So you specifically have certain groups, like I think it's no secret that people who tend to be successful in business and politics tend to be white and not, for example, black or Latino. So why not use social justice, I guess, specifically to, I guess, even the playing field for people who tend to be specifically harmed by implicit bias?
Yeah, so evening the playing field used to manifest in positive discrimination, and I guess the real-world application of that is affirmative action, which takes individuals and identifies their individual mitigating and extenuating circumstances with the intention of giving them opportunities that they may have been denied because they deserve it. What is manifesting today in social justice activism isn't positive discrimination, but negative discrimination, identifying individuals as tribes and groups that seem to have benefited from subjective criteria like historical privilege and meting out collective downward social leveling, negative social leveling. That, first of all, is unattainable. American institutions can't do that. Second of all, it's psychologically damaging to think of yourself as being a prisoner in that sort of an environment, to think of yourself as being a combatant in a campaign against collective groups. It dehumanizes your adversaries. And once you dehumanize your adversary, you can do a lot of things to them. It's a dangerous concept, and it's one that I think needs to be combated.
Just as like a quick follow-up, so do you think there's any value, for example, to like maybe a little bit of affirmative action to provide, for example, maybe like an example would be like in the black community to have maybe some given a slight advantage to them to have maybe some certain members who are then able to act as a representation or a symbol of success and leaders within inside their communities? Do you think like maybe instead of having it be like proportional to the population where you have maybe like quotas that you have to have a certain amount of black people that would be representing the population, like maybe meeting a certain level more than I guess what would be like if it was a complete meritocracy?
Yeah, so this book doesn't take on individual policy proposals like that, but you said two different things. Affirmative action is one thing. Quotas are something very different. We have experience in this country with quotas, and they result in far more injustice than the kind of justice that they achieve. That's a much longer conversation to have, but there's absolutely a very negative history associated with quotas. They do not achieve their stated aims, and they create a series of new victims. Individuals should be treated as individuals. Once you begin to treat people as classes or tribes, then you begin to bet the kind of injustices this is addressing.
So it seemed to me like you were saying that social justice, in part, is about doing away with this myth of impartiality, this idea that, it sounds like what you were saying, that how people on the left see it, social justice people on the left see it, is that white men, straight, able-bodied, young white men came along and said, and established the game in such a way and said, this is impartial. And in doing so, in universalizing and normalizing their habits, their customs, their value system, they turned everybody, all non-whites and women, into the other. And social justice is about creating a space in which all voices are heard and there's no hierarchy. However, while I agree with all of that, it seemed like you were suggesting that in your attempt to explain Donald Trump, that in comes Donald Trump, and what does he do to win the election in 2016? Well, he appeals to that one identity group that's been told, you're really bad. You've oppressed everybody else. And so instead of transcending identity politics, Donald Trump has just added fuel onto the fire. And so my question is, where are you getting that? What's your evidence for that? Why don't you think that no, he was really appealing to the American people and America first, making decisions in all of the people's interests, as opposed to just one sliver of these, this medley of identity groups?
Sure. So a comprehensive argument is in the book, and it requires a little more elaboration than I think we have time for here. But in the Republican primary, many of Donald Trump's arguments were to a very small section of the Republican electorate, holding that their lots in life had been stolen from them by cheap labor, by Chinese goods, by elites in positions of authority who looked down on them. And this wasn't only condescending, but it was discriminatory, and that these individuals could effect some sort of a social reversal by appealing to his movement. That is indistinct, in my view, from quite a lot of the arguments that you see on the social justice left, that they hold that there is a ill-defined set of forces that have stolen from them that which is their due, and there is merit to these arguments. But when it creates a paradigm in your head of some sort of a paralyzing victimization, one that you can only resolve by appealing to a political force and providing them with support, or by buying a certain product, or by demonstrating your fealty to this or the other ideology, somebody's selling you something. And it's a disempowering philosophy. It's not that it's untrue, it's that it is antithetical to the conservative ideal, which is that you are the master of your own destiny. You have individual agency. This steals that from you. It's a powerful organizing force. Conservatives have long known that identity politics appeals to identitarian and tribal solidarity. Really quickly form a political coalition, and a pretty durable one. It's just that it's deleterious to the social fabric, and you have to not do that. That's the conservative argument. It's a resisting temptation thing, which is difficult to do in practice because this is a very potent temptation. But as far as concrete examples go, there's quite a few of them in the book. And all you need to do is listen to the activists who populate the alt-right to tell you how emboldened they were when this individual wouldn't abandon them, wouldn't drop his support for certain people in certain groups who he thought were buttressing his coalition. They'll tell you precisely what moved them and what made them and what animated them. And it's in the book.
Hi there. Thank you again for coming out this evening and talking to us. Just a question as a Hillsdale student, as someone who has worked for NBC, associate editor, someone who's involved in the media in an era where it's quite rare to have someone like you, or someone who's not necessarily of the, I don't want to say the professionally outraged ilk, but of the social justice mainstream view. How would you recommend, or what would you suggest to Hillsdale College students who are looking not just to enter sort of the media field, but to enter the workplace in general in this new era? What would you recommend to them as someone who has managed to successfully traverse through all that to get to where you are today?
Oh man, I don't know how successfully I've traversed any of this stuff. So far, so good. But there are landmines before you all along the way, right? It's difficult. Social justice, as I demonstrate in these pieties, as I demonstrate in this book, have become pretty prevalent and long ago escaped the confines of the campus. They affect how interpersonal relationships work in the real world. It's reshaping our politics. It's shaping how businesses structure themselves. Increasingly, social justice activism has become something that businesses are building into their business model, that they are accounting for lost revenue due to activism from their youngest employees. I mean, that's part of the business model. It's difficult to say how you can navigate that world because it's so new. This book will hopefully help you identify social justice in the wild. But insofar as if you want to go out and combat this phenomenon, I mean, hopefully the ideas here are going to help you to isolate and stigmatize this philosophy. It appeals to self-interest. These ideas are powerful, and they are rooted in noble and just philosophy. And they are attractive to people who are good people. And you have to approach them as though these aren't bad ideas, and the people who agree with them aren't bad ideas. They're dangerous ideas, which is different. It's very distinct, by which I mean that they make you as an individual a less attractive member of a political coalition. Ideally, if you're a member of a political coalition, you have some things you want to get done, right? And so in order to achieve that, you have to get 50+1 at the polls, critical mass of voters' support. And if your coalition is dedicated to ideas like the kind of ideas that the Women's March adopted or a white nationalist group adopt, you are a less attractive member of that political coalition. And that political coalition will divorce itself from you, as they have to. And so the argument here is pragmatic. It's towards self-interest. You and I may agree with a lot of this stuff. It may be pretty good, but it's making our lives harder. And there is models to which we can appeal. For the right, you would look towards the early 1960s and the efforts by Barry Goldwater, Russell Kirk, and William F. Buckley to isolate and stigmatize the Bircher movement, which were successful. The Democratic Party can similarly appeal to the precedents that were set in the late 1940s when the party ousted the communists from the organized labor movement. And finally, I recommend a rededication to the study of civics in schools. We have abandoned the study of civics in favor of social studies, diversity studies, things that have nothing to do with civics. I'm loath to recommend legislative solutions to this sort of thing, but I do entertain the notion of tying a certain amount of education funding to the certain amount of hours studying civics, by which I mean the Constitution, the Declaration, the Federalist Papers, the American ideals. Because if all you know of the American ideal is that we have failed to live up to it, what would you think is worth preserving? But that is a misunderstanding of the word ideal. Ideal is not something you achieve. It is aspirational. The operative word in the phrase, a more perfect union, isn't perfect. It is more. The action is always in pursuit. Achieving something is, especially an ideal or a perfection, is a utopian goal. It's never going to be realized. But that doesn't give you the license to abandon the effort.
So you kind of just mentioned how it's a debate of ideas and alluded to the 1960s with Barry Goldwater and the debate of ideas then. It's a slightly different ballgame now because at the time you had thought leaders like Barry Goldwater. Now with social media, everyone is their own thought leader.
Right.
How do you do that in 2019?
Yeah, so are you familiar with a guy named Matthew Continetti? So he writes for, he pretty much manages the Washington Free Beacon, and he's a really astute student of conservative history and philosophy. And he calls what you call thought leaders gatekeepers, the people who are responsible for maintaining political dialogue's level of erudition. So that, and I talk about this in the book, that the barriers to entry into political discourse have been broken down, and much the better. but it has led to a proliferation, in my view, of the kind of entry-level politics that I talked about, the fixation on small things, which suffice for politics. They sort of mimic politics, but they're not really politics. And again, the argument here is in self-interest and in pragmatism. You're not engaging in anything productive here. It's like putting the car in neutral and hitting the gas. A lot of energy, but you ain't going anywhere. And that's essentially what the argument that I hope will carry the day makes, is that this is a lot of wasted effort that can be dedicated to more productive political solutions. And this is not a book that advocates, obviously I have a political opinion, I prefer conservatives to be successful at the polls, but this argument appeals also to liberal Democrats, as it should. If you're wasting all your time screaming at young adult novelists online, you're not getting anything done. You might feel like you're affecting some really powerful campaign or cultural crusade, a social reversal. You're not. Nothing is being achieved here. And that is an argument that I hope can be applied a little more broadly. So you're right, there are no more gatekeepers. Everybody has to be a gatekeeper. This is a way for you to do that.
To what extent do you think that the social justice left will help determine the 2020 Democratic nominee for president? And if you were advising a candidate, would you say, embrace that movement, they're going to lead you to victory, or shy away from their tactics? I would say shy away.
So we just saw, I have a piece in the New York Times opinion page yesterday about the Jussie Smollett phenomena. I've been following this. So we didn't know anything about this yesterday that we didn't know 2 weeks ago. We still can't make a definitive determination about what happened there. But that's the whole point, right? A lot of elites in political positions of political authority and a whole lot of 2020 candidates went on the record real early saying that these individuals who perpetrated this alleged crime were not individuals who perpetrated an alleged crime. We weren't even talking about the allegations against these individuals. We were talking about a societal sickness that was revealed as a result of this phenomena. Our biases were confirmed and they suspended disbelief. And that wasn't because they didn't know that they were walking into a trap. I think in the back of their minds they probably did. But there was social pressure on them because the social justice left, which is so powerful an organizing force, despite their relatively modest numbers, they exert disproportionate influence in the ways I talked about in this speech. That they knew that their left flank would go after them if they reserved judgment. But reserving judgment was the proper course. It would have preserved their credibility. Their self-interest should have been satisfied by keeping their mouths shut, but they didn't do that. They abandoned self-interest in order to appeal to this particular interest group. There's a lesson there if anyone's willing to take it. I suspect nobody will be willing to take it because as always, the moment is much more pressing, I think, than the sort of the prudence that would have preserved some credibility there. But yeah, hopefully they will. The lesson there is that there's a real trap in trying to be the most woke person in the room, and hopefully they will begin to see it.
Anybody else? I have a question, if that's possible. Okay, no worries.
I can't believe it.
I know, right?
We've answered everything.
So you mentioned specifically young adult novels, comic books, and in that world right now, it seems like in the industries themselves, there's a real hard push towards social justice. The comic book awards prominently rewarding more social justice-oriented comic books. Same thing with young adult novels. And I was just wondering, do you think that there's any reversal? Like, do you see anybody in these spheres moving away from social justice, or is this something that they're going to continue to barrel into until there's disaster?
I'm not sure what the disaster would look like. You would think that somebody would wise up to the game after a certain point. So as the social justice movement, particularly on the left, but not exclusively, has grown broader, its targets have become smaller, in part because if you were to organize an outrage mob against somebody who is not receptive to those kinds of campaigns, you would look really bad because they just ignore you. And then after about 3 or 4 days, the whole thing dissipates and goes away. You don't demonstrate any power or efficacy that way. You don't demonstrate your disproportionate influence that way. So they have begun to focus their energies on people who are predisposed to agree with them, social justice warriors themselves. There's a real weakness there that I think is pretty evident once you just look under the hood. But in the moment, when you're facing a social media mob, for example, you feel really put upon, and it's pretty scary. And so you're inclined to genuflect and demonstrate your social cachet and your hyper-awareness of inequalities, and sacrifice what is in many ways often manifests in income, in your own position, both income as far as your job goes or what have you, and I demonstrate this a couple of ways in the book. And it's not an equation that is really benefiting the people who supplicate before these mobs. They don't get anything out of the deal. They don't get any sort of deference after they have done this. They don't get to go off quietly into the wilderness once they've sacrificed whatever it was the outrage mob is trying to get you to sacrifice. They keep hounding them. Why? Because now you're a willing target. There's blood in the water, and you have to continually demonstrate this kind of efficacy and authority and power, even if it's illusory. And so again, once you begin to recognize these patterns, then you can begin to see how they unfold and stop them. If you were to stand your ground, for example, amid a 3-day, 4-day social justice mob, and your employer backs you, which is rare, you have to have some social standing there, and the employer has to know that this goes away in 3 and 4 days. But it always goes away, and that dissipates this authority, the authority that we're ascribing to these sort of things, which is based entirely on the illusion of efficacy. So I hope this book demonstrates that.
Just one more question. With the Me Too movement over the last 2 years and such, I think we can all agree it was overdue that a lot of these individuals were dealt with. I mean, no one would argue that certain individuals, they should have been in jail a long time ago and deserve to be in jail. And there has been a divide, though, in the Me Too community where you have individuals like a Harvey Weinstein or a Kevin Spacey, and then you have characters like Aziz Ansari, where the left, or the mob on social media, essentially overlooks a lot of the facts and perhaps jumps to conclusions associating the two when the actions taken, even by the accuser's account, do not even remotely equate necessarily to the level. So with when you're addressing something like the Me Too movement, when you're addressing something like the Me Too movement, how then do we approach such issues where there is a prevalent abuse going on within a certain industry or whatnot, from certain individuals or whatnot, or from a certain group of people, for instance, Hollywood moguls or whatnot, or et cetera? How do we address that without delving or falling into the idea of identity politics? Because in a sense, it was predominantly or almost entirely white men. And obviously, I wouldn't advocate that being the thing. If there's a white man in Hollywood being accused, we have to believe he's guilty. But how do we address such widespread abuses and widespread crimes, essentially, without falling into that?
Yeah, so
or maintaining a system where people can still get away with it?
Well, what was happening there, right, was we had a lot of private institutions that were violating the law. These institutions were shielding powerful men from the consequences of their actions under the law. What that required was a social reckoning and a sort of actualization and awareness in society that was, as you say, overdue and good and beneficial. Where social justice advocates and I part ways on that is the role the public sector plays in affecting that sort of change. The actions that were being undertaken by these individuals and shielded by public or by private corporations were already illegal. The notion that there is some sort of manifest legislative action you can take in order to hasten that social change is undercut by the fact that these laws were already on the books in multiple different ways. Anti-discrimination acts against women, anti-violence acts against women, those things were there while these men were evading reckonings for their responsibilities. The private sector and a societal awakening to those sort of things is good, is beneficial. It's not something I argue against in my book. It's something that needs to happen. And in that sense, a lot of social justice activism is based in noble ideas and has a robust philosophical foundation, as I said. And a lot of that is deserving of attention. What happens when we go off the rails is what happens when you apply that to a case like Justice Kavanaugh's. So you take that social reckoning and you try to achieve something that is manifestly unjust. by attempting to litigate this not in a courtroom. Everybody said this couldn't be litigated in a courtroom. It wasn't in the province of a courtroom. It was something that needed to be dealt with in the court of public opinion, and that you couldn't treat an individual as an individual. This wasn't Harvey Weinstein. This was some guy from college who assaulted me. This was some guy who I knew way back in the day, who looked a lot like him, who was mean to me. You saw a lot of this in the public press, in the Atlantic, in the New York Times opinion page, people who were judging Judge Kavanaugh not as Judge Kavanaugh, but as an avatar for a kind of individual who had wronged them in the past. That's not what the Me Too movement was about. It was about identifying people who were horrid and forcing them to come to account for their actions, individuals and their crimes, and either facing a court of law or, if the statute hadn't run out, forcing them out of their occupations. That is just. What was happening in a much more broader context wasn't just. So there's, and to say that I have all the answers here would be wrong. I think that's a pretty blurred distinction, and one that requires a lot of deference on our part to the experiences of other people and openness to having difficult conversations. But I think that there's a pretty obvious distinction between judging individuals as individuals and judging people based on their demographic traits inherited at birth, which is the distinction between the cases you're identifying and the broader application of this in the Me Too movement as it evolved over the course of the last 2 years, culminating in the Kavanaugh thing.